Friends, I wanted to talk about homelessness today. The increased rate of child suicidal ideation in the United States. But I wanted to start with homelessness. I read in the San Francisco, the sfgate.com, I think it is, that people defecating on the streets has become a real major issue now. It's like in 2011, it was a fifth of what it is now and what it was in 2018. There was 28,000 or something instances of human feces on the street in San Francisco. Now that says a lot about San Francisco's the neoliberalism that has evolved over decades globally, because homelessness has increased tremendously in over the last 3 decades in particular. And it was almost unheard of having homeless people. It was a very, very small percentage of people in Australia were homeless about 3 decades ago. And that was because we hadn't, partly because neoliberalism hadn't clicked in, and also because we had a better mental health system than we do. Our mental health our systems for dealing with mental health have deteriorated because of neoliberalism, because governments have been privatizing this and that and gradually privatizing Medicare, trying to privatize Medicare. And that's been happening in the UK, and it's been happening, of course, leaps and bounds in the United States. And back to San Francisco, the rate of homelessness has increased tremendously. In Los Angeles, it's increased tremendously. Here in Australia, it's increasing. This is not acceptable. If we as a society think that homelessness is in any way acceptable, then there is something really, really wrong with us. The fact that there's even a problem of any kind of people having no public utilities to go to in San Francisco and defecating on the streets. And of course, a number of these people would be people with mental health problems, and there would be homeless vets from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and so forth. And this is a tragedy that we shouldn't accept. And another thing that is happening because of the tremendous pressure that people are under now, I mean, the level of debt in Australia is very high. I think the level of debt in the United States is very high. This is the neoliberal scourge, which in many ways capitalism cannot be anything but what it is now, which is causing tremendous inequality and is giving social welfare to the corporations. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about this many years ago. He said, there's social, I think it was him, social welfare for the rich, and rugged individualism for the rest of us. And that's so true. So it was obviously a real problem back in the 60s and late 50s for him to be mentioning that, if indeed that was him who said that. But this is something that we should never normalize. Homelessness should never be normalized. People struggling constantly and having to work 2 or 3 jobs should never be normalized and never be seen, no matter what George W. Bush thinks about that when he said, oh, that person's working 3 jobs, and he applauded them for that.
You don't have to worry.
That's good, because I work 3 jobs and I feel like I contribute.
You work 3 jobs?
3 jobs, yes.
Uniquely American, isn't it? I mean, that is fantastic that you're doing that. Get any sleep?
Not much. Not much.
He should be absolutely embarrassed. Any of these people, if they had any sort of idea, any sort of care about the public, if people are having to work more than 1 job to live comfortably, then people in power should be absolutely appalled and should do something. And of course, the reason why it's reached this level where people are struggling to survive is because the people in power are interested in power. They're not interested in the public anymore, if they ever were, but they certainly are not now. So the fact that people in San Francisco, there are so many homeless people in San Francisco, and people have contempt. This is where it's at. A lot of people have contempt for homeless people in the United States. Is sort of it indicates to me a spiritual malaise, a spiritual death of a society in a way, that we've become so anti-human and so lacking empathy and so mean-spirited and so it's so unjust. There's no justice there. The fact that black people are being killed at a rate of 3 people a day, and the police get off over and over again, despite the fact that it's just outright lynching in public, or in the back streets or whatever, or in somebody's car when they're basically sitting in their car or running away. These are all indications of Chris Hedges said the time for appealing to the machine is over. We have to break the machine. And when I read things like, people having nowhere to go to do their bodily functions and doing it on the streets. I mean, everybody in government should be absolutely ashamed and appalled that things are like that. And I keep hearing about the amount of homeless people in Los Angeles. We have a homeless situation here in Hobart. I've been around for almost 6 decades now, and I'm not saying Australia was, great in the 70s and 60s, 70s and part of the 80s, but it certainly was, and it certainly was pretty awful to Indigenous people, but it certainly was better in relation to the situation for people bringing in an income that they could. Here's Alia again. She's wearing her little bird be safe collar. No, we don't like to dress up our cats. I like to mention that. She always likes getting in my videos. The fact that we have gone from free healthcare in Australia and free public education, like people could go to university and not pay a cent. That's what it was like in the 1980s in Australia. And, there was a real sort of a better sort of an appreciation for what a society should be. That people should basically, a job should be a way, yes, of making money, but it shouldn't be where your whole life is struggling to make ends meet to the point where you are not taking notice of what your government is doing. And that's part of the issue, part of the intention too, is people are so busy struggling now that you're too busy or too afraid to actually to be able to address things, because basically people have become in some ways too afraid in the United States to even put on their social media different things that they're unhappy with, because basically the bosses in the jobs that they might be going for in the future basically scan social media to find out your history. And we have the NSA on top of that, basically reading private emails, transcribing with algorithms, calls, etc., and collecting 90 billion emails a day in the NSA, as well as I think a few, about 30 to 60 billion phone calls every day. They say that they're claiming that they're now going to think about ditching it. That's a joke. But that's what they're saying, the NSA. That'll be the day. I think they're just saying that so that the public will think there's something wrong with it. But anyway, the other thing that was really shocking to me, and I did not know about these stats, and that is children. The increase in child suicidal ideation in the United States, or children that have tried to kill themselves, has increased from, I think it's doubled actually in the last few years. It was about 500,000, and 500,000 children between the ages of, this is under 18. Sorry, this is 500,000. I'm not sure how many of those were between the ages of 5 and 11. But in the last few years, it's actually reached 1,600,000, and half of those are between the ages of 5 and 11. So basically, like about 800,000, something like that. No, yeah, that's right, 800,000 children between the ages of 5 and 11 have had suicidal ideation, or they have tried to kill themselves. 5 to 11. For ages 5 to 11. The fact that a 5-year-old is even knows what that is, taking their own life, is sort of like, it's so appalling. And that to me indicates that we have to do everything we can in nonviolent ways to change this dreadful, dreadful system, because it's obvious that there are children now, and this is in the United States. So you can imagine, say, somewhere like Palestine, the Palestinian children with the constant the apartheid situation there, or all the countries that, say, the U.S. empire has helped destroy, and like in Libya and Syria and all those places, Iraq and Afghanistan and all of that, and they've destroyed a lot of the communities with killing and bombings and all of that. That there must be a tremendous amount of despair there. But it indicates in the United States that there are children that are as young as 5 thinking that their life is not worth it. And I'd say that part of that, and possibly a big part of that, is it could be the terrible struggle economically that a lot of families experience now, and the unemployment. That's why it's important that we understand MMT. That's not going to solve everything, but it certainly will address. If you go to the hashtag Learn MMT, that addresses a lot of issues of economic illiteracy that a lot of us have, which we can then insist on in a sovereign economy. We can insist that governments do what they're supposed to be doing, and so that's a very important thing. But there are things that can be addressed by understanding MMT, which is just simply the operational reality of a sovereign economy. And so, but we have to sort of, as Chris Hedges said, sort of break this machine, because there is no appealing anymore to these oligarchs and these people who are supposed to be public servants but are really rulers, and who are not interested in the working class. They're not even interested in the middle class. And it's appalling there are classes, but they're not interested in either of those. They're only interested in the upper class, the corporations, and lining their own pockets through lobbyists, etc. And it's heading that way in Australia too, very slowly but surely. And why wouldn't it? When people see an opportunity where they can line their pockets, the people who are problematic always end up at the top. The people who end up in power are usually problematic because they're more interested in power than they are in actually doing any service for people. It's rare to actually find anybody who's really actually interested in doing anything for people. And so we have to remember that. These people are not our friends. Like people like to call different politicians by their first name. I don't know why, because these people are not our friends. The reason they may say all the right things prior to elections, and then when they get in, they either immediately do the opposite, like Obama did in the US, or they start to fall away, because politicians don't become more ethical when they get into office. But I just found that such an appalling thing, and I imagine social media, when it comes to children feeling suicidal, I think that probably abuse, as in there's domestic violence, there's sexual abuse, there's also social media bullying, there's also terrible economic struggles that families are going through due to neoliberalism. There's lack of mental health support because the health system is in tatters in the United States, and here in Australia it's death by 1,000 cuts with Medicare. It used to be free in the 80s, and it's still free to some extent, but you can see that they're doing their best, like they are in the United Kingdom, to whittle it away, make it dysfunctional so that it ends up being privatized. They like to make public services dysfunctional so that they can then privatize them, and that's what they're doing. We have a hospital here in Hobart that needs desperate attention, and what does the other side of the coin, the other major party, the Labor Party, go and suggest that we need an injection of 120 million, I think it's 120 million, for tourism here. Well, we're doing fine with tourism here in Tasmania. That's what most of it is. We don't need that. We actually need that money to fix the major public hospital. But would they do that? No. This is the thing. It's like that will go to businesses, that money. And this is the thing. This is the thing that happens over and over again, is that these people in power, they always end up pretending like it's for people, but it's really just lining the pockets of businesses and corporations. So, you know, and this is the Labor Party here in Australia. That's their idea of campaign promises, lining the pockets of businesses. And they've completely forgotten about the Gough Whitlam of the party where Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, and he was for free healthcare and he was for free public education. And the CIA admitted that they helped get rid of him in 1975. I remember that. I'm old enough to remember that. And, you know, and they that was the end of a really good Prime Minister and a really good, you know, free public education, free healthcare. And it's been a neoliberal mess ever since. So we can thank here in Australia the CIA for helping get rid of a Prime Minister. You know, they admitted doing that, and that was a really great one. And he was a Labor Prime Minister. And now we have this mess that we have, which is heading towards the sort of thing that's happening in the US. I've seen a really quite a functional and a relaxed kind of Australia. And I'm talking as a white person now. It's not like that for Indigenous people. But as a white person, and also even as, you know, it's been a lot more accepting of multiculturalism in Australia. Of course, there's been racism all along, but it seemed to be a lot better in that regard in the 70s and 80s. And then I've gradually seen it unravel since Gough Whitlam was taken out by the CIA. Not literally taken out as in killed, but, you know, he was dismissed, and they were playing a part in it. But I've seen the unraveling of a really great, what was a pretty good and relaxed society where people only needed one job to be able to get by, and there wasn't great levels of debt, and people were living relatively comfortably. And it was actually, you know, going fairly well, and it's gradually... And I saw it right before my eyes, including my own profession. Nursing turned into a bit of a nightmare in some ways because they tried to make nurses do a lot more for the same money. And if you weren't, there was never any downtimes. You used to be able to get downtimes when you were a registered nurse. And then then neoliberalism set in, and then they decided, no, there will be no downtime. You'll be shipped off to somewhere else and they'll work you really hard. And then, you know, there was no ability to just have any downtime anymore. And now they're expecting nurses to work a lot more. And it was already very, very busy, you know, in the early parts before neoliberalism set in. It was already busy, but it was doable. And now I think it's the whole way of training is just lining the pockets of universities now. And I don't think it's actually very helpful as a hands-on experience for people. They used to have hospital-trained nurses, and they would pay them. Now you spend all your time at university and very little time in the hospitals, and then some people get out of these university courses and then think, I don't really want to do nursing. I don't really like doing the hands-on stuff that much, because that's a lot of what nursing is. Of course, it's, you have to have a lot of knowledge as well, but I mean, you have to get a good idea of what you're going into, but they don't really give you that. But anyway, see, it's just all something that's just my opinion. I don't know, other people may disagree with that about nursing. But, and also if you hurt yourself, they just put you out to pasture. If you hurt your back, there's really not much support. It's a little bit, not as bad as what they do to Iraq vets when they come home, and they just discard them if they have problems. But I mean, they put you out to pasture, basically, as nurses when you injure yourself. So anyway, I'm getting off track here, but it's all related. And so when I read this thing about San Francisco, and I've been to San Francisco a couple of times, and that was the last time I went there was the late 90s. And it was, it's a beautiful city. I don't know the inner workings of it, but it's a beautiful city, and that made me sad. And I've been to Los Angeles. That always seemed a bit problematic to me, but I didn't actually go to Los Angeles in the late 90s, but it's sad, all the homelessness. It's just absolutely not acceptable, and none of us should ever accept that there is a homeless situation. We should never accept that, and we should always make any politician who thinks that we need to trim the edges of this homeless situation and not really address the root cause of it, which is neoliberalism and how we've allowed corporations to dictate what happens to us all in society. Governments have allowed corporations to take the reins, as Chris Hedges calls it, inverted totalitarianism. We should not ever accept. We should not ever accept that. We should never accept the sort of that we should never accept that we are expected to pay for healthcare, particularly when we have a sovereign economy and it can absolutely afford those services. It's a currency issuer, and the only constraints are resources. So we should, and I invite you to check out StephanieKelton.com. Stephanie Kelton is Bernie Sanders' economic advisor from 2016 and now 2020, and she's a proponent of MMT. She understands how sovereign economies work. She's not putting out any of the economically illiterate nonsense that a lot of politicians put out. And so if you understand MMT, the operational reality of a sovereign economy, then you understand that we can absolutely afford free healthcare, free public education, we can fix infrastructure, we could fund a fantastic mental health care situation, we could fix the public hospitals and so forth. So the only thing that is missing is the will of politicians and the will to actually do what they could be doing right now with a sovereign economy. They can do it for military things, mind you, but they don't do it for the people. That tells you everything. So we have to find out about our economy and how that can work for us right now. And we also have to absolutely reject any politician who is not absolutely head-on addressing homelessness, addressing all the issues that are just the basic needs of people, having a shelter over their head, like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. We have to go back. We have to return, if ever there was a state, we have to return to a society where we care about one another, where we value community, where neoliberalism isn't allowed once again to destroy communities, which is what it has done. That's part of the destruction of communities. We have to return to a society where empathy for one another and caring for one another and justice and social equality and equity, that all those things, and caring about minority groups, all of that sort of thing, we have to return to that, and we should never ever allow it in our heads to think that what is happening now is normal or acceptable, and we should not ever allow any politician to give us the message that this is normal and acceptable and that we should be vilifying homeless people. That's outrageous. That we should be vilifying anybody, that we should be vilifying Muslims or any other group and vilifying them and making this ridiculous propaganda that they're taking jobs, etc. All of that is just racist nonsense. So we mustn't ever let this become normal. And it has become normal in something like the United States, homelessness. And that is absolutely, that indicates a spiritual death, and we cannot let that has to be addressed. All that sort of thing has to be addressed. Otherwise, we're all just heading towards serfdom. That's where we're heading. It's absolutely not going to stop until we're all just serfs and they're the feudal lords. And people have let this go on for far too long, and I don't even know whether it is reversible, but we must push back against that. And as Chris Hedges says, there's no more pleading for the better ethics of these people in positions of power, because they're not listening anymore. So it's a non-violent civil disobedience is where it's at this point. But also we can do something understanding the operational reality of a sovereign economy, so we can demand from politicians and say, if you don't start using the economy the way it was meant to be used for the people, then we don't vote for you. All of that, and grassroots movements, non-violent grassroots movements. And yellow vest movement. I mean, look at what the French are doing. They still are protesting. And it's being met with unbelievable force. It just shows how they're trying to crush the calls of the people that are rejecting neoliberalism in France. That should tell you something about how this is going to be met. But it has to be, we have to keep pushing back on this. Anyway, that's all I was going to say. Really, it makes me incredibly sad and also angry when I read things like children feeling suicidal at 5 years old or trying to kill themselves. I mean, that is just so appalling. And people not having anywhere to go to the bathroom and they're living on the streets. It's just, I can't stand it. I can't stand it. I don't know about you, but it upsets me so much, and it makes me feel despairing, but it also makes me angry. And we have to feel about this. We have to feel a sort of a rejection and an anger, but a positive anger where we actually do something. Because otherwise, it is a spiritual death of all of us if we let people be homeless on the streets and not having anywhere, having to beg for things, having to defecate and wee on the streets. I mean, that is just, what kind of society have we got? Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please click the subscribe button and the notifications bell. Otherwise, you don't receive any notifications when a video drops. And please click the like button if you've liked the previous content. And please leave comments. I always enjoy your comments, and I thank you for taking the time to make them. Okay, thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.
What is now beginning to take place throughout the world after so many decades in which the class struggle was suppressed, there is a growing movement throughout the world of the working class against conditions that exist. The ruling elites see this. They know where this is going. They feel the threat. And their response to this threat is to move further and further to the right, to begin preparing for massive confrontations, and that is why they begin to encourage the growth of fascistic movements. And I'm going to conclude with a brief explanation of what we mean when we talk about fascism. What is fascism? Well, you can use it, and to some extent with justification, given the experience of the 20th century, as a word which denotes horrifying forms of dictatorship, mass violence against people, killings and torture, and that's entirely correct. You can speak of fascistic personalities, leaders who have of a fascistic character, and Trump certainly corresponds to that. But a certain clarification must be made here, because an important theoretical and political issue is involved. The socialist movement began discussing fascism in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the formation of the Communist International. And certainly the response of the ruling class internationally to the Russian Revolution, the first great overthrow of capitalism, was violence. The organization of military squads, extra-parliamentary groups to attack the working class. A certain new type of phenomena came into existence, which was initially personified by an Italian politician by the name of Mussolini. And what was distinct about Mussolini, an ex-socialist, an ex-syndicalist, was that he had the idea that he could organize paramilitary squads, recruit among elements within the middle class, utilize their hatred of the workers, and direct them against the working class. And he came to power in 1922. There was a period of political struggle, but by 1925 he had consolidated a dictatorship which had a certain amount of mass support based in elements within the middle class which were directed against the working class. In other words, it was a form of dictatorship which didn't just rely on the military, the police, but sought to create a broader social basis for the destruction of working class resistance. Mussolini inspired Hitler. And Hitler took this concept and expanded it and was able to build, especially in the aftermath of the Depression, which broke out in 1929 and the growth of mass unemployment, and the desperation of ever broader sections of the lower middle class, a mass movement, stormtroopers, military squads, for violent attack on the working class organizations. And this was the specific character of a fascist movement. You might say historically there have been such movements in the United States. Certainly the Ku Klux Klan was such a movement. The organization of a middle class, lower middle class rabble against the working class, particularly the African American working class, to smash their resistance to oppression. Now, Trotsky explained at the time that the only way a fascist movement could be defeated was through the mobilization of the working class, and he made another point, that fascist movements can never really come to power until that point when the working class is demoralized, where it is unable to find a path to power. And then elements of the middle class and the population who are wavering between these two forces lose confidence in the possibility of socialism and turn to the right. Now, I want to make this critical point. The next stage of development among the masses of workers in the United States, and including broad sections of the middle class, will not be to the right, it will be to the left. We live in a country where wealth is concentrated in a very small section of the population, really the top 10%. Below that level, life gets harder and harder and more impossible. The bottom 50% have nothing. Those between 50 and 90% are in various levels of acute struggle, trying to make ends meet. That's the almost universal American experience. And that's a broad social basis for the growth of a socialist movement. But the challenge is to provide that great mass of the working population with a political program, with a perspective. And for that, you require the development of a conscious revolutionary movement, a conscious political party. If that is done, if the objective conditions are acted upon, not only can fascism be defeated, but we can establish a socialist society. That is our perspective, and history proves that is correct. Fascism doesn't just waltz into power. It's a punishment, to be blunt, for the failure of the working class to create that leadership. So I'm going to conclude now on the following point. Because everyone here has to make some decisions. We can make speeches, we can explain as best we can, but if you think we're correct, and you see the dangers, and you recognize on an objective basis the possibilities, then you have to decide what you're going to do. And I hope that what you're going to decide to do is decide to build a revolutionary movement, turn to the working class, unify the great, powerful force which exists within the society. Black and white, Hispanic, straight, gay, that's not the central distinction in the society. The main distinction in this society is a class distinction. Those who control wealth in staggering levels of billions, which are wasted on these people, while hundreds of thousands and millions in this country go hungry or lack education. People have to struggle, are deprived the most basic rudiments of culture, and are threatened with catastrophes such as war, climatic disruptions. You've got to decide what you're going to do. You've got to make the decision to fight, and if you make that decision, then you should join our party and help us build this revolutionary movement within the United States and internationally. Thank you very much.